In the next two lectures, we will focus on organizational learning. We'll look at questions such as a leader, how do we create a learning organization? How do we drive continuous improvement? What are the different types of learning processes that we must shape and direct? And we'll turn to the question of why observation, direct observation, is so critical to learning and improvement. And finally, we'll try to understand how we can become more effective and astute observers of different phenomena. Stephen Jay Gould once said, "Look in the mirror and don't be tempted to equate transient domination with either intrinsic superiority or prospects for extended survival." And a wonderful phrase. I mean, he's sort of telling us, don't get fooled by short-term success. Don't look in the mirror when you are doing well and convince yourself that everything is fine and that there's nothing that can be improved upon. We always have to be willing to reflect on our experiences, even when we're successful, and try to find ways to get better. And that's what leaders need to nudge and push and shape and form their organizations to do. They need to get them to be in this constant renewal and reflection process. It can never stop. That's unending. Let me tell you a story about an interesting process of reflection and improvement. There were two men in the 1950s that came out of college and that were not superstars in the area of professional football. In fact, they were barely hanging on in the field of professional football at the start of their careers. Their names were Johnny Unitas and Raymond Berry. Johnny Unitas was a quarterback and Raymond Berry a wide receiver. Unitas was cut from the first professional team that he joined and then joined a different team. Raymond Berry was a mediocre college player who barely was able to get a job in professional football. They both landed with the Baltimore Colts in the mid-1950s. Raymond Berry was particularly astute in watching game film, long before players were doing this on a regular basis. He would take the film home to watch in his apartment at night. He would look at how his team was playing and how it could improve its performance. And he would examine the film from competitor games and try to understand the competitors' strengths and weaknesses. And he would begin to invite his pal Johnny Unitas over to his apartment. And together, Raymond Berry and Johnny Unitas would watch film after film of games, some of their own, some of the competition. Now, several years later, Unitas and Berry had become all pros on the top of their profession in the National Football League. And in fact, they helped guide their team, the Baltimore Colts, to the National Football League championship game against the New York Giants. This is a game that came to be known as the greatest game ever played. It really was the birth of professional football as one of the most popular sports in America. Well, late in that game, the Colts trailed the Giants. And Unitas stepped to the line of scrimmage, and he saw an odd defensive formation being used by the opponent, the Giants. Most quarterbacks would have been very confused in that situation. But interestingly, Unitas had seen this odd formation once on film several years earlier. He and Raymond Berry, together in that apartment, had been watching some film of the Giants, and they noticed a scheme employed, designed by the legendary defensive coach for the Giants, Tom Landry. Only once had they seen this particular strategy, and it was very unconventional. And in that apartment, they had discussed what the best strategy might be to deal with that odd formation. They never saw Landry's strategy employed in another game until this particular moment now in the late 50s when they're in the National Football League championship against the Giants. And they knew precisely what to do without even having to speak with one another. They simply looked at one another, sort of reminding each other subtly that this was something that they had thought about. They hit a big play, and they went on to win the championship game. Well, that's an amazing story. It's a story of engaging in a powerful form of learning. Many athletes and coaches do this. They watch the game film so they can learn from past experience, theirs and their rivals. And we can all watch the game film and learn from past experience. And as leaders, it's a critical capability we need to develop. Let me give you one more famous sports example of someone who achieved remarkable performance by reflecting on their past experience. Hall of Fame baseball player Tony Gwynn was one of the first players in his sport to watch film on a regular basis. He was obsessive about it. It began one day early in his career when he was in a slump and struggling. And he phoned his wife back home. He was on a road trip with the San Diego Padres. And at that time, VCRs were just beginning to become popular and in the homes of many people. And he asked his wife to begin taping on their VCR the games the Padres were playing. And using that simple, rather crude way of actually evaluating film, just simply taping the games on commercial television and then watching them in his home, he began to dissect his swing and the flaws in his swing as a batter. And he went on to come out of the slump and do remarkably well, and he continued to watch film throughout his career, and he became one of the greatest hitters in baseball history. This example of learning represents one of several powerful ways in which organizations can learn and improve over time. Learning is one of the fundamental processes of change and improvement every leader must master. David Garvin is an organizational learning expert who has pointed out to us that there really are three fundamental types of learning that leaders must foster and cultivate within their organizations. The first is around intelligence, the second is around experience, and the third is around experimentation. In this lecture, we're going to be focused on intelligence gathering, and we'll look at the other two modes of learning in the next lecture. Now, in terms of intelligence gathering, there really are three ways we can do that. We can sort of search for data and information, drawing on established sources of data, scanning the environment, and looking at databases, looking at the media, external sources that might have information that's useful to our organization. Or we might be a little more active, not just looking at what's out there already, but actually engaging in what Garvin calls inquiry. That is, interviewing and surveying people and building a data set of our own. For many organizations, this is done through market research, things like surveys and focus groups. And the third powerful way we might gather intelligence is even more active than inquiry. It involves actually directly observing various constituencies to understand how they're behaving and how that might impact our ability to improve our performance as an organization. As Yogi Berra said, you can observe a lot by watching. Observation turns out to be a critical skill that every leader must master. Why? Why is observation so important? Well, let's think about your organization for a moment. Many of your organizations, whether they be in the private or public sector, conduct focus groups. They bring sets of people together and ask them questions and try to understand whether they're pleased with your organization's performance or not, and how might you improve. Well, what's the problem with focus groups? Fundamentally, the problem is that people often say one thing and do another. Well, why is that? Why don't people actually tell us the truth, if you will? Well, they're not lying to us, it turns out. They may, in fact. Perhaps some do. But in most instances, people are saying one thing and doing another for a variety of other reasons, including the fact that sometimes we are asking leading questions of the members of a focus group. Group dynamics within this team that's been brought together to provide us feedback can cause a distortion in the conclusions they present to us. And lastly, the workings of the unconscious mind can actually get in the way and cause people to say one thing and do another. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful about just asking people about our performance and using questions and their responses to drive our strategies for performance improvement. How do we solve this problem of people saying one thing and doing another when we conduct surveys and focus groups? We can, as leaders, engage our organizations in more direct observation of various constituents. We have to behave like anthropologists, like Margaret Mead, who was an ethnographer. Ethnography is a method of studying a phenomenon by directly observing people in their natural settings. That is what Mead did in her famous anthropological research. So can we do that as leaders? Can we become anthropologists? I think we can. In fact, interestingly, there's a very popular show on television called Undercover Boss, where we see executives, go in disguise and actually go out and observe what's happening on the front lines of their organizations. It's a humorous show, but it's a powerful idea. The notion that sometimes leaders get very disconnected from what's actually going on at the front lines of the organization. with their own employees and customers and suppliers and other constituents. And so getting out there and observing and encouraging others to directly observe can be a powerful way to gather intelligence that can be used to learn and improve over time. Well, let's look at some of these problems that we encounter in more detail. Let's look at some of the issues that arise when we ask questions of others to try to gather feedback that might be useful in improving our performance. The first problem I want to look at is the issue of leading questions. Elizabeth Loftus has done some remarkable research on the subject of leading questions. And specifically, she's examined how small changes in the wording of questions can make a huge difference in terms of the responses we receive. We have to be very careful based on her conclusions in our ability to interpret data, because we may be leading people to say something quite different because of subtle changes in the way we ask questions. In one study, she showed a group of students a video of an automobile accident in which one driver runs through a stop sign, turning right into busy traffic and causing a 5-car collision. Well, after showing the video, she distributed a survey to her students. She asked half the students the following question: how fast was car A going when it ran the stop sign? She asked the other half a slightly different question. She said to them, how fast was car A going when it turned right? Loftus then asked everyone, did you see a stop sign for car A? Well, more than half the students, 53% in the first group, answered that they'd seen the stop sign. Yet only 35% of the students in the second group indicated they had noticed it. Remember, the second group had a question asked of them that did not include any reference to the stop sign. And thus, less of them now report that they saw it. 35% versus 53%. So a subtle change in wording leads to a dramatic difference in responses. Loftus concluded that we can affect responses by including or excluding what she calls crucial presuppositions in our questions. She's defining a presupposition as a condition that must hold in order for the question to be contextually appropriate. In this case, one question presupposes the existence of the stop sign. Now, interestingly, in a subsequent experiment, she went even further to see how the inclusion of even a false presupposition could distort responses. So she went back to her favorite video, the video of an automobile accident. This time it's a slightly different one. And she asked half the students, how fast was the white sports car going when it passed the barn while traveling along the country road? In fact, the video showed no barn along the street. The other half received the same question, except without mention of the barn. And then, of course, she asked all the students, did you see a barn? Roughly 6 times as many students in the first group than in the second indicated they had seen a barn in the video. So insertion of this false fact had distorted people's recall and response. And so many people have shown that the way we ask questions can distort responses. Loftus experiments are one way, but we know from a vast array of research that leading questions are a problem when we seek feedback from others in a variety of settings, something we have to consider when we try to interpret data that we receive by asking for feedback and then try to learn and improve. There is also, though, the question of group dynamics. We bring a group of people together to provide us feedback, and a few loud voices or perhaps a table thumper or two can squash the level of candid discussion within a group. Or we may have individuals who are afraid to disclose their preferences or opinions in front of others, sometimes others who are complete strangers. If they don't have close relationships with the others in this forum, they may be reticent to share how they actually behave or what they actually think. And finally, marketers have learned that individuals sometimes distort their true preferences in some cases because they're concerned about how they present themselves to others. They're worried about whether their behaviors will be considered socially appropriate or acceptable. And thus they may use these opportunities where they're providing us feedback to portray themselves in a certain image because they're trying to present themselves to others in this environment. All of these factors of group dynamics may cause people to actually tell us things that aren't quite indicative of how they're truly behaving, truly interacting with our organization. and therefore we might jump to the wrong conclusions. And then there's the problem of the unconscious mind. People often say one thing when confronted with an abstract idea, and then act in a different manner when that idea becomes reality. For example, when marketers go out and ask individuals about brand new products, they might get inaccurate responses because it's a product or service that an individual really has no experience with, isn't accustomed to. It's so strange or foreign to them that they offer thoughts and feedback, but it's really not useful. It's not indicative of how they'll actually behave in the future. Gerald Zaltman is a marketing expert who's done a great deal of research in this area, looking at this discrepancy between saying and doing. And he's arguing in his findings that it may be completely unintentional in many cases. He concludes that customers may not always be able to discern what they want. He has said unconscious thoughts are the most accurate predictors of what people will actually do. And in the space of 5 or 10 minutes in a focus group, you can't possibly get at one person's unconscious thinking. Going beyond even that, organizational learning experts Chris Argyris and Donald Shun have done work on the role that the unconscious mind plays in explaining this gap between what people say and do. And they've argued that we hold certain mental models or theories in our heads, and we actually hold sort of two different kinds of theories of action in our brains. We have our espoused theories and our theories in use. And what do they mean by that? Well, our espoused theories are how we sort of think we behave. And our theories in use are how we actually behave. And the bottom line is that we aren't always aware of that discrepancy, that we sort of come to bolster a self-belief that we behave a certain way. Those are our espoused theories, and we convince ourselves that's really how we behave. And the mind is playing tricks on us, if you will. And therefore, we say things that may not be indicative of our actual theories in use. So there are many reasons why, when we ask for feedback and try to learn from constituents, such as employees or customers, we don't actually get the right conclusions. So there are benefits then from direct observation. And we have some companies doing this and learning a great deal. They're hiring anthropologists to join them and do this work, in fact. Let's take a look at a couple of firms. Kimberly-Clark is a company that markets and sells Huggies diapers and the diaper complements. They've been very successful with their line of products. But at one point, they began to go out there and study how moms and dads were using their products. And they went out and, in fact, observed parents on the go, changing their infants at locations outside the home. What did they observe? They saw moms and dads struggling to hold their babies still while reaching for the diapers and wipes and diaper cream and the like, and trying to get those out of the package and then use them to help the child and to change the baby's diaper. And they saw all this fumbling and bumbling and all these struggles. And I mean, I've experienced them myself, having had 3 children and thankfully now moving out of that phase. But you do have that problem of struggling with holding that toddler so they don't run away. They watched this, they observed it, and they redesigned their travel pack for Huggies baby wipes. The new packaging enabled parents to remove a wipe with one hand and thus enabled them to always keep their other hand on the child and not let them scoot away. Similarly, the researchers watched as parents had difficulty when they were bathing their children in opening Huggies baby wash while bathing their children, because of course they wanted to hold the child so they wouldn't fall in the tub. Again, they only had one hand free, so they redesigned the bottle so the parent could open it and dispense the liquid with only one hand. So direct observation led to product innovation, led to gains in market share, and all sorts of new opportunities for revenue for the firm. At Procter & Gamble, led by the firm's CEO, A.G. Lafley, they really undertook a massive change, a transformation in how they researched consumer behavior. They moved a great deal of their research away from surveys and focus groups toward direct observation. Lafley learned the value of watching how consumers behave when he accepted an assignment in Japan in the early 90s. At the time, he didn't have access to extensive market research data in Japan. He had to find another way to learn what innovations would meet consumers' needs. He remembers concluding, executives in the U.S. were buried under consumer research data. I don't think the answers are just in the numbers. You have to get out and look. He said, richer, more actionable insights are identified from what is learned in the context of the real world. And so he focused the budget on immersive research techniques, getting people out there to watch how consumers are behaving. But he didn't just ask his marketers to do it. He asked all of the senior executives to do it. He understood there was power in getting executives out of the suite at corporate headquarters and into the field to observe employees and consumers, to learn by looking, and then reflect on that and find ways to improve. How can we then hone our powers of observation? I mean, Lafley worked hard at this with his group in the organization to improve the way you observe. Because it turns out just going out there and watching is not enough. There are better and worse ways to actually go out and observe out in the field. Let's go through some do's and don'ts then. We want to definitely try to wipe away preconceived notions before we start our observations. We don't want to begin with a strong hypothesis and expectation of what you are going to see. Right? You see what you expect to see, after all, in many instances. So wiping the slate clean is an important first step. We want to collect observations under different circumstances and from varied perspectives. We don't want to draw big conclusions from a small or biased sample. We want to seek our informants wisely. We don't want to rely only on the observation or discussion with one particular expert. We want to record what we're observing carefully. That means taking good notes when we observe, including quotes from key conversations and important artifacts from out in the field. We don't want to just commit everything to memory, because our minds can play tricks with us. We can forget. We can rationalize what we saw. We want to engage in active listening, not ask leading questions. Active listening means following up, making sure you've heard correctly and you've interpreted correctly what you're hearing, asking clarifying questions, engaging with the person whom you're having a conversation with to make sure you're coming to the right conclusions. And lastly, you're keeping systematic track of observations that contradict your early conclusions. You're not seeking and recording data primarily to prove a pre-existing hypothesis. You know, David Garvin pointed out that Charles Darwin, when he was working on his theory of evolution, actually kept a separate notebook of observations in the field that were contradictory to his early conclusions as he was building the theory. And by doing that, he was able to hone his theory and improve his thinking. So he was welcoming discordant data, not shunning it as he went about his work. So we can hone our powers of observation by wiping the slate clean, looking for different perspectives, keeping good notes, engaging in active listening, and keeping careful track of things that contradict our early conclusions. As leaders, if we follow these sorts of techniques, we can not just be out there watching, but watching astutely and effectively. JetBlue founder Dave Neeleman provides us a wonderful example of a leader who went out and looked, who went out and observed and used it as the basis for improving how he ran the organization. It's been said that Neeleman, the founder of JetBlue, when he would fly on the company's planes, would often join his flight attendants in providing drink and snack service to customers on the plane. One journalist has described this as his snack and schmooze drill. He would actually don an apron with his nickname, Snack Boy, as he worked the aisles up and down on the plane. Of course, not only was he listening to and observing customers on these occasions, but he was interacting closely with his pilots and his flight attendants. He could see them in action and speak with them very informally. One crew member explained, "Seeing David is great. He's so easygoing and we get to talk." So what we see here is this opportunity to engage in a way where you are working informally alongside them at times, and you're learning a great deal from them and from the customers. Neeleman was indeed an astute observer, and I think it's not surprising that JetBlue has consistently been rated very highly in customer satisfaction in many airline industry surveys. This notion of executives getting out there and engaging and observing and using it to constantly improve is a powerful one. Well, what's the challenge with observation when you're the leader, when you're the boss? The more senior you are, the more challenging it is to actually use observation to drive learning and improvement. Now, that doesn't mean you can't foster observation on the part of others in the organization that can be then used to drive improvement. But you have to be careful with how you observe and the effects that your presence may have on others' behavior. Tom Stenberg is the founder of Staples, a company that I worked for in the mid-90s. In fact, I worked there when Stenberg was still CEO. And he loved to get out and visit the stores. He believed an executive could only drive performance improvement if they were engaged with what was going on the retail floor of Staples, which was a large office supply chain. And he would travel the country visiting stores. And he hoped to make those surprise visits because he recognized that one of the challenges of observation is the fact that if they knew he was coming, that they might alter their behavior, that he wouldn't see what was really going on in the stores. But what he found was even these secret visits weren't so secret. He would arrive at one store in a particular geographic region, and as soon as he walked out the door to then go visit some other stores, that store manager would be calling all of his peers in the area, or her peers in the area, and spreading the word. And so by the time Stenberg walked into the second or third location, they were very prepared for his arrival. His presence was biasing their behavior, and therefore his observation was not as productive as it could have been. So we have to solve this. We have to fix this observer effect as leaders if we're going to be effective. How do we do that? Well, let me say that we're not going to completely avoid this problem. But we certainly don't have to reveal our identity when interacting with certain constituents, such as customers. I'm not encouraging individuals to lie. I'm simply stating that you may say you work for the company without making a big deal that you're actually one of the top executives of the firm. You're going out there and engaging with constituents and learning from them. And if you're simply an employee, you may have them open up to you in ways that they wouldn't otherwise, and you may have them not bias their behavior as much or change their behavior. If they thought you were a senior executive, if they recognize that, they may alter their behavior much more dramatically. Second, of course, you can use others who are less well known throughout the organization to conduct observations. And then you can spend time comparing notes with them. This method can be particularly useful when you're observing internal company observations. That second set of eyes can provide illuminating insights. So I would argue that part of the job of the leader is to engage in direct observation themselves, to get out of their executive suite and out on the front lines. But it's also to encourage and empower others to observe, to get out there and watch. Stenberg tells a funny story about using another set of eyes. He once asked his mother-in-law to order and then return office supplies from the delivery arm of one of his rivals. As a result, he was able to learn a great deal about his competitors' product return policies and procedures. Third, I think leaders can actually take part in the work on the front lines, as Neilman did at JetBlue. By becoming a participant observer, Neilman experienced key activities and interactions for himself. He didn't have to rely strictly on the observations of others. He made the practice of donning the apron rather commonplace. And when such activities become routine, the likelihood of distorting others' behavior begins to decline. He's building a rapport with the crew members. They're accustomed to him being there, and so they trust him, and they're open up to him about problems that need to be addressed. That's very important. And of course, by engaging in the activities himself, he's understanding the obstacles and frustrations of crew members because he's seen them himself as he's figuring out what's hard, what's difficult in the conducting of their work. Finally, leaders can check the conclusions from their observations against other data. For instance, did a store visit yield an experience consistent with what customer satisfaction surveys or other metrics show for that location? If inconsistencies emerge from that comparison, then the leaders can sit down with employees to discuss the discrepancies. Then they might conclude that they had some distortionary effect on the behavior of people when they went to observe. Final word of caution about observation. Our minds can play games with us, I've said. And I think that's important to remember. We can convince ourselves that we don't have anything to learn from others. Our existing mental models may prove so strong that we can't acknowledge what we're actually seeing, that we're dismissing opportunities for improvement because we're so convinced that we have it right, even when we go out and observe something that might suggest we don't have it right. And there's a famous story of the beginnings of the product Kleenex, the tissue that we've all become accustomed to in supermarkets throughout the world. The Kleenex brand began as a product, a tissue that was advertised for women to take off their makeup. And that was initially the way the product was marketed, and many people, of course, bought it for that use. But as women took it home to take off makeup, many men in the household started blowing their nose with this tissue. And what's interesting is the company took a while to actually acknowledge that unintended use of their product and realize the opportunity that was before them. That they could actually go out and market this tissue as something that could be used when you had a cold or an allergy, and that would explode the market opportunity. They were observing this unintended behavior on the part of customers, but they weren't willing to acknowledge and incorporate it into their thinking for a while. It took a while because they were blinded a bit by their initial conception of the product. And that happens to us all. We observe, but we don't actually want to acknowledge what we're confronting, especially if it says something different than what we expect. So what are our takeaways? Learning and continuous improvement are crucial, and leaders have to foster learning in organizations. And that involves intelligence gathering, reflecting on experience, and experimentation. And we've talked in this lecture mostly about intelligence gathering and the power of observation and the power that it has and the advantages it has over traditional methods such as surveys, interviews, and focus groups. But there are challenges when using observation as a learning technique, and it's only one tool in our toolkit as leaders. So in the next lecture, we'll turn to the issue of learning from experience and learning from experimentation so that we have a broad array of tools available to us as we try to drive learning, improvement, and change in our organizations.